Phails at philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life such a mystery. Phails at philosophy. Building who he wants to be. Living life in harmony. Phails conception, perception, reflection, knowledge, experience, experiment. What did he learn in college? Phails at philosophy. What the heck could it be? Life such a mystery. Phails at philosophy. Building who he wants to be. Living life in harmony. Phails.
Welcome to Phails. Phails at philosophy. We're here today with Grant Potts,
professor of philosophy, religion, and humanities.
Phails 5 questions.
Okay.
How would one fail at philosophy?
Not caring. I think that's the easiest way to describe it, because I think at the heart of what philosophy is, it's careful thinking. Mm-hmm. And so not being careful is how you fail at philosophy.
Yeah. Not being careful with thinking.
Yeah.
What would careless thoughts look like? When
you're trying to be careful about thinking, you're trying to think through things and get them right, using thinking to understand and know your world, and understand and know yourself, or understand and know anything. If you're being careful, what you're doing is trying to say, okay, I want to get things right. I want to understand things well. I want to know things as they are. And I'm attending to the things that seem to produce better results in that. I think the simplest way to kind of look at it is through reason, which is, of course, is this big backdrop of philosophy is reason. If you're thinking about something in a situation where reason is helpful and you don't use your reason, and you don't care to use your reason, and you're not, maybe you don't use it because you've realized that being careful requires something else, and that's using your reason to understand when reason is applicable. But if you're just like, whatever, I'll just connect the dots however I want, and I'll come up with an idea, and if it's true, great, and if it's not, then you're not being careful.
Yeah.
Right? And then you're failing at philosophy.
I've never thought of reason as a verb. With your reason. Mm-hmm. Is that a verb?
To reason, yeah.
To reason.
Yeah.
So I've heard of reasonable. I've thought of that a lot. I've thought is what I'm deciding or what I'm doing reasonable? Mm-hmm. But I've never thought of to reason.
To reason. Yeah.
How do you reason? The more I say it, the weirder that word is.
There are certain ways that numerous traditions of human thought have formalized understanding how we come up with ideas that work, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to come up with the best way to frame it, because it's not just like that work pragmatically in the world, but maybe that work coherently in a system of thought, like geometry, right?
Yeah. Theorems and stuff.
Yeah, so, and all of that relies on a notion that certain things follow from other things, right? Yeah. Certain ideas follow from...
this, then that.
Right, and if you've got a combination of those ideas in a certain way, things follow from it. And they follow from it because if you understand, with geometry, one of the things that's interesting about it is relatively universal. And that if you understand these very fundamental principles, what a point is, right?
Yeah.
What a line is, what it means to have parallel lines, right? A certain definition.
Yeah.
And you put those together in the way the propositions put them together. If you have these kinds of triangles, you can produce this kind of circle, right, out of it.
Yeah.
Those very basic principles, those definitions, those postulates, those common notions, which are the 3 kinds of principles in geometry, if you follow them and you follow them through a basic sense of what follows from the other and put them together, you can create this entire world of geometry out of it, right? It's working because it works as a coherent system. Right.
Yeah.
It also happens to be a coherent system that we have found is very practical if we're doing things like building bridges. You can have really coherent systems that don't have that practical value or haven't shown that practical value. Yeah. There's whole areas of mathematics, for example, where you have systems of coherent mathematics that are really cool. Right.
Yeah.
But what's their value? And sometimes it takes hundreds of years before people discover that. But so when I say it's working, it's not necessarily that it's working in the world, although that can be another way you're being careful.
Yeah.
But that, You're getting the results you're looking for.
Yeah.
And you're understanding things more.
The word that came to mind, and I don't know if it fits in here, is logic. Reason and logic, maybe.
Logic is one formal system of reason.
Okay.
Geometry is another formal system. And they have relationships because, geometry is built off deductive logic as a form of logic.
Second question is, how would you know if you're succeeding at philosophy?
There's a number of ways to figure something like that out in general, right? And I think part of the problem is like when you're saying at philosophy, since philosophy is really about fundamental processes we use as thinking beings to engage our world, right? It's often hard to be, what's unique about philosophy? One way is because other people who do that thing and they check out what you're doing and they're like, yeah, that's right. That's why it's important to do things in communities of people of practice.
Kind of consensus.
Right. And sometimes you can be stuck with a bunch of people who are full of shit and you're like, hey, they're validating me, so you got to be careful.
Yeah.
One way to do that then is to expand the circle of people. Like, I don't know if these people are totally full of shit that I'm working with.
Yeah.
Let me go over here with these other people who say they're doing this thing, but seem to be doing it different, and figure out what's going on with them, right?
Yeah, I just thought, while you were speaking, I thought at some point in history, I'm sure a consensus of groups that we all thought were really intelligent were like, we should bleed people from the brain in order to get the demons out.
Right. Or enslave other human beings.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There was consensus.
A whole host of things that humans have had beliefs in that are either false or reprehensible as things to believe. There's that validation that is validation through consensus. And it's important, but it's also through consensus in the context of authority, right? If you want to know that you're fixing your car well, inviting your neighbor over who knows nothing about cars, right? Is not as good as actually talking to your neighbor down the street who's actually a mechanic
for 30 years. Yeah.
So, but it's interesting, like, because your question, how do we know? I detect in that, because when we use the word know, we often have a model of knowledge which comes out of philosophy in the last 300 or 400 years, right? Which has been really focused on knowledge as certainty, right? How do we know? How do we know for sure? How do we get certainty? And I just don't think you get that. Like you don't get to know that, right?
There's no capital T truth. Is that?
Yeah, I mean there is, but it doesn't have the quality of certainty.
Because it can change over time, or because why is that?
Because it just doesn't seem to be the case, right? Like maybe because of the limitations of our cognition, maybe because
we don't know what we don't know. There's just so many variables that are unknown.
Right. And it may be that we also live in a world in which the structure of the world we live in is defined by ambiguity. We don't know that, right? One of the things that we often, especially new students to philosophy, talk about as an intellectual virtue that's central to philosophy is intellectual humility. There are definitely philosophers who have formalized intellectual humility as a centerpiece of good thought. Right? It's not just a good habit to start off with, but that structurally you need to approach knowledge in that way to get good knowledge.
What is intellectual humility?
And that's just a recognition that there's more limitations on what you can know than there are ways you can find knowledge, right? And that's just part of being a thinker, right? And
humility, being humble.
Right.
Yeah.
That you're often able to get really, and it's actually probably part of good cognition to begin with, right? To operate in the world as, for lack of a better word, a being in the world, right? Something that exists in the world and has to kind of like operate and figure out what to do there. With your thinking, part of what you have to do is just come up with ad hoc theories about how everything works so you can start operating, right?
Yeah.
And then you have to adjust. And
you have to be willing to fail, or be willing for them to be wrong or be malleable.
Right. And there's lots of contexts in which we operate in which being rigid around those can be helpful, right?
So when there's growth mindset, I've always thought as growth mindset is really positive, but maybe there's there's rigidity that's helpful.
It can be and it cannot be. And so I think the problem is we often have those moments of rigidity because rigidity gives structure, right? What is rigidity? Like if you have a good picture of the world and you can operate, this is how my household works. We do this, we do this, we do this, right? And it works and it's flowing until it's not, right?
Yes.
And so, so the ability to know when you need to kind of recognize, oh, that's just an ad hoc theory I put together to help me operate, It's time to adjust that theory because I'm operating in a different situation.
Awesome.
Right? That's really hard to get, right? That's the hard part of knowing.
We want to fix it and forget it. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't allow for what you're talking about, this, we're constantly adjusting because change is the only permanence.
Right.
And so we're always kind of adjusting, always changing our viewpoint or our formulas or our frameworks.
It's just cognitive bandwidth to some extent too, right? We don't have a brain that can assess all the variables at once, right? You know, so coming up with some kind of good theory that works for now is actually really effective at being like, I can think about the other things in my life.
Yeah. So what I heard there was consensus, an authority of a consensus.
Oh yeah, back to your question.
Yeah.
How do we know that we're and
consensus, authority, an authority of consensus? The thing I had kind of with that question was, there's some internal referencing, I imagine, too. We've got that external referencing of the authority, the consensus, but there's some inner knowing.
Right, yeah, and you get that through practice, right? And I think that's the thing, is that
experience.
At the end of the day, you have to make that judgment for yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And there's sort of like, there's no knowing that you know that you're right. There's just making the decision, I'm going to go with this.
Yeah.
That's actually what knowledge is what you can go with. Mm-hmm. There's sort of deeper questions about what kind of life that way of knowing produces for you and everyone around you. How many people does that way of knowing include in the world that would be encompassed by that? Like, I think those are kind of better ways to think about truth with a capital T if we want to do that. But you've got to make that judgment yourself, right? Yeah. There are certain things like good deductive reasoning, understanding both formal logical fallacies, which are different than what a lot of people talk about as fallacies on the internet, which are more interpretive fallacies. They're fallacies that are often, take a good one. Argument from authority is a fallacy, right? It's a fallacy if we say, because there's an authority, we know this to be true with certainty. Because authority is not going to give you that certainty.
Right.
Turns out, if you look at the best arguments in the history of philosophy, there's not much that's going to give you that certainty. Hume presents what are very difficult arguments to get around, that we can get certainty in terms of mathematical coherence in closed systems, although there's often arguments that those are even difficult to get to. And we can get certainty in terms of like basic sensate data, right? Not like I see an apple, but just, and even not even like I see the color red.
Yeah.
But in that data that then we ascribe the word red to, but that most of our knowledge of the world is based off of inductive principles, right? Enough cases of this and I can go with it. But we can't figure out how many cases we need to actually know, right?
It's not like the 100th monkey,
right?
Type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no like general inductive threshold, right? We know in these particular cases of particular types of things, we can have statistical significance to know that's likely to be true.
Yeah.
In Hume's argument, how do we know that the sun is going to come up tomorrow? We know the sun's going to come up tomorrow because it's come up every day.
Yeah.
But how do we know that's going to happen tomorrow? We ultimately have to go back to this principle of induction. But how do we know that the principle of induction works, right? Well, because in our life, we've used the principle of induction, so you end up in this circular loop, right? And so getting to certainty is actually really difficult outside of kind of closed theoretical systems.
Yeah.
We don't know. We just test and see and ask ourselves, like, do I seem to be operating in the world in a way that I understand it? Do people seem to like actually recognize that in me?
Yeah.
Do the experts recognize it in the sphere? But also, do the people around me actually seem to follow, right?
You know what I thought? I thought if I left my house today and I went to the grocery store and there was a bin of apples, and instead of apple, it said wombats.
Right.
And I was like, oh, those are apples. And I bought them and I went to the register and they're like, oh, you want wombats? And I was like, yeah, I want wombats. But how long would it take me to start believing that those weren't apples anymore? Those were wombats.
Right. That's more kind of labeling. It's hard because like we have many cases in the way we tell stories about the history of science of people who went against the grain, right?
Yeah.
Because those are the dramatic narratives. That's what we forget, is we have those stories because they're not the norm of science. They're the exception. And good science is usually through consensus.
But then there's a place for exceptional people.
Right, exceptional.
That change consensus.
Or people who, I mean, it depends on what we mean by exceptional people. people who have an exceptional moment, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, most good scientists will tell you that, like, if you start getting ideas about what's going on that are very different than what everyone else understands,
You probably
check your instruments, do all of that stuff first before you start. And then once you start putting it out there, be like, hey, this seems to be the case. Can some of the rest of y'all check this out?
That's when you start having replication.
Right, exactly.
Third question. If one or myself wanted to fail at philosophy or succeed at philosophy or just introduce philosophy into my life in a daily basis, what would I start to do?
One of two things. Read philosophy or go study formally in a philosophy program somewhere, which will probably have you read philosophy and give you people to talk to about it.
So read philosophy and study philosophy.
Yeah, and talk to other people who are studying. I mean, I think that's
rats.
That's
I got to go back to school, Grant.
Yes, I do think so. If you want to fail in a certain, if you want to just fail, you can just start.
Well, I want to
talking to people who know philosophy and get. But I think part of the problem is that philosophy is a tradition, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe a set of traditions, set of parallel traditions we find around the world, right?
Yeah.
In Western academic philosophy, that's a tradition that is understood to go back through the Middle Ages in Islamic and Christian and Jewish thought, back to the ancient world in Greek thought and whatnot. In South Asia, that's through the classical schools of philosophy of India. In China, that's through...
I'm getting into a lineage.
Right, yeah. There's a lineage of it. And I'm particularly interested in those because I like looking at those and saying, oh, there's these very interesting parallels to how they come to, there's not exactitude. Like, there's a whole mode of reasoning in classic Vedic thought, right? That parallels formal reasoning in Western thought and is very close, right? But there's certain interesting differences that you read about and you're like, either that's a difference in term or it's a substantive difference, and it's not always clear which. And people, and a lot of like historians of philosophy debate, like, is this a substantive difference, or is this a difference in term? But when you back away from it, you see there's a real parallel way in which all of these traditions are trying to use how our mind seems to understand the world on the basic level of, like, beginning with, like, when I pick up a glass, how do I know how far away from it is? How do I know that it has water I can drink? How do I engage in both understanding what's there and then making predictions about what I can do with that? If I drink this, I can become, less thirsty.
Yeah.
Right. And validating that, because if it's the wrong stuff, I might kill myself. Right.
Yeah.
We
really need to know how much ice is in it, because if we think there's less ice, we put it up and the whole thing falls,
just comes all over us and stuff. Right.
That's an important one.
So these basic ways we engage with the world, taking those and saying, well, what works, what doesn't, and then how can we use that to ask questions that aren't so obvious in front of us?
Will I pick a lineage? Is this like karate versus jujitsu versus... When you talk about the different histories and different lineages of philosophy?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think you have to. I don't think it's a lineage in that way. I think they're big, open conversations, and we're at a point in history where those conversations are coming together.
Okay.
And they're defined. Yeah, and that's different than a lot of, like, traditional lineage systems, which are often very much about closing you off from bad knowledge, right? Bad data.
Okay.
Things that will corrupt your intense specialization in this tradition of kung fu, right? We see how that can lead to its own problems because it gets you very brittle, right? People often go the other way and they're like, oh, well, you don't need lineages. You just go with what's best from all of them. But you do have to have some sense of things. That's why I do think reading a book is actually the best approach, because books are these unique artifacts we have as human beings, especially in works of philosophy, that are book-length arguments. They're book-length explorations of a particular idea. And so they capture both. There's something where you can be brought into a particular world, a particular way of thinking, a particular way of looking at the world, to see how it works, to try it out, to engage with it. That is substantial. Like, if you're reading a good philosophy book, you're probably going to read it over a couple days at least, if not a couple weeks. Think about it, spend some time with it. But then after a month with it, you're on to a different book, right?
Yeah.
So you get to both have the advantages of some sustained encounter with a way of looking at the world and the advantages of it being compartmentalized enough in your life, you can go try out some other things, right? So I think, if someone wanted to fail at philosophy, reading philosophy books would probably be the best way to go.
Yeah.
If you're just working on your own. Of course, you can like listen to philosophy podcasts and do those kinds of things too.
Yeah.
But
is it something
But I
about
think
the text?
there's something more sustained. There's something about the way.
Is it something about reading the book? Can you hear the audiobook? Or is it, what is it about reading?
I think there's an intimacy with reading, maybe with an audiobook, right?
I just see an older man with a candle and just like he's to himself, kind of isolated with this information.
I don't know if you got to read, because when I use read, I mean that generally. I mean, like you
immerse yourself in
you read it or you listen to it as an audiobook. There are ways that you think about things different when you're reading than when you're listening. I think it's actually great to do both, right? But it's about creating a relationship with this text, right? This thing that's sort of a stabilization of communication of thought from one human to another. That is of length.
I like that. And what came up for me is it's important that you read it or even listen to someone reading it. I know that we can't watch a movie about it. And I know that because my daughter and I watched Stephen King's The Shining. She had read the book and then we watched the movie. So it's important that we don't immerse ourselves in someone else's interpretation of, we need to make the interpretation ourselves. Is that important? Because then you're like, this isn't like the book. I heard a lot.
A lot of my colleagues would say yes. I don't think it's that important.
I could watch a movie about a book.
Sure. That was, I think that we're always getting other people's interpretations of stuff before we step into it. We come to it with a whole set of interpretations of the words that are used that are different than the author would use it. So I think that whole don't get someone like if you're a pure, I'm not a purist, right? Like I just don't, I think purity is like a dead game. So whether you watch the movie first or read the book, because of that, because reading's hard. Right. And there's a level of cognitive focus you have to bring.
And dedication. You're with this for days and it's kind of meditation.
Right.
You're saying I'm renouncing the world and all these things, these other places I can put my attention.
Right, exactly.
In a room by yourself.
Yeah. So that's so that it's a form of contemplation, right?
Yeah.
So that's the second thing I'd say is I do think that formal contemplative practices are important. I think that doing geometry, doing logical proofs are really forms of contemplative practice, right? We don't recognize them as such because we want to say, contemplative practice is this woo-woo.
Well, I hear that as meditation. When I think of contemplative practices, I think of meditation.
Yeah, I mean, probably one of the best arguments in Western philosophy, just sort of as a formal argument, is Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, right? Where he comes up with the idea of the cogito, or at least expresses it formally.
The idea of the
cogito, the idea that the way I know I exist is because I exist as a thinking being, right? That often gets reduced to I think, therefore I am.
Okay.
Right? I teach that text often, and I teach it to my students partly because it's a good classic text of philosophy to be kind of immersed in, to have as a teacher in itself, and it frames how we think about mind-body dualism in the Western contemporary world. Really comes back to this argument with its problems, and it's and it's a meditation, right? It's a series that he writes it as a series of 6 meditations that go over time, and he's he imagines himself sitting there and it's interesting reading with students who've had some contemplative practice as a background, whether it's through yoga or Buddhism or prayer in one of the Western traditions, because they read it and they're like, whoa, this is like a meditation, dude. I didn't think philosophy was going to be a meditation. But it's really, and like most contemplative practices, it's defined by a discipline, and that discipline is formal reasoning, right? A discipline of formal reasoning of some sort is important. Most of my colleagues, their discipline, just because of their lineage of how they were educated, and Western philosophy in the contemporary academic framework is really focuses on formal logic, right? And particularly symbolic logic, which is really cool as shit. Like but mine is I use geometry as an example because that's the older form of formal reasoning training. And that's where I got my formal reasoning training, was really in geometric practice and doing geometric proofs. But I think something like that is important because it trains your mind to be careful, like I said, right?
The first one. To not be careful is
and
to
go step by step, right? When I have my students do geometric proofs, really it's about learning, they'll say, all right, the first step is this, the second step is this. And I'll say, well, why can you do that, right? And so they have to say, and if you look at, when you do a geometric proof, you say, well, I can do this because of this, right? I can do this because of this. And everyone skips steps. Like when you start doing geometric proofs, you're just skipping steps all the time because you just your brain wants to put it all together into the big picture.
But you want them to slow down? You do every step?
You got to slow it down and do the careful analysis to know, right? To know that you can actually get there. And that just trains your mind to be very careful about taking each step carefully, to say, well, and then it becomes a tool for living a life, and living a life with a commitment to a good life that understands the world, right?
Yeah.
And you can say, well, I've concluded this about this person. That's my friend, or my, someone in my, someone I'm buying groceries from, positive, negative. I've made this judgment. Well, how do I know that's true?
Yeah.
Right? And it does. It slows you. Now, that can be maddening if you try to do that all the time. Like I said, just as operating consciousness in the world, we have to not do philosophy, right? We may live our lives from the fruits of doing philosophy, but it is about that moment.
When you're socializing, when you're being a social being, you're not philosophizing.
Or building your house, or any number of things, right?
Yeah.
These are special moments that are carved out that allow us to kind of telescope into the way of knowing and take it step by step. And that's cool in itself, right? But it also gives us practice that we can do that a little bit more intuitively and get it right. And
yeah. So, fourth question, how would I demonstrate that I have been influenced by philosophy or studying philosophy? If I did number 3, like read philosophy and studied philosophy, how do I then demonstrate to my peers or start to show up in the world as someone who is on the way to being a philosopher or has philosophized? Or
why would you want to do that?
I don't know. What does the fruit of this labor look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's different than how do I demonstrate. Yeah. Because the demonstration thing is, I don't know if you can. I think you can demonstrate that you've understood this geometric proof or this logical argument by going to a board without your notes and doing it.
Talking. Like writing them down.
Right, and
that would be I demonstrate that I can do.
That is what a geometric demonstration is to demonstrate that given these things, I can get to this thing.
Right. So how do I share the fruit? How would I say, folks, the bounty, the fruit of my...
The fruit of philosophy and how you show it. I mean, classically in many of the traditions, the warrant of good philosophy is a good life, right?
A good life.
Right. Like, you're doing it right because you're leading a good life. And that is the purpose, right? Now, good... What do we mean by good, right? We often hear that in our kind of nihilistic world, right? We live in terms of how we understand what good is, and we think like a life of pleasure, right?
Hedonism.
I've got a good life, right?
I drink wine,
and
go on vacations.
That's one way of understanding the good life, right? There are definitely in classical systems of philosophy around the world, you can find hedonistic arguments as the arguments for how you're leading a good life. Right. But the good is a term of value. It's not a term of pleasure, right? When we say good, we mean something has value. And if we're a hedonist, we say it has value because it leads to pleasure. And I think, so I think when we think of leading a good life, what we generally mean by that is leading a life of value, right? Leading a life that is rightly valued as such.
A life that's valued, and that would be by the community that it's in? They would value its contribution. They would, or is it
maybe it's what is good, right? Yeah. So you got to. That's one of your questions to figure out. What is good, right?
Yeah.
And that leads you then into a space of thinking through that. So it's a little tricky. Like you're not going to get your rubber stamp from the universe that, like you are officially validated as a good thinker doing philosophy well. Like it's just not going to happen that way. Like you're going to be like, oh, it's about the good life. And oh man, now I got to figure out what is good. And initially I might think good is like a nice evening at home, watching a good show, drinking a good beer. And is that good? Right? Is that, one question I like to think about and ask people to think about sometimes is sort of like, we often look at our lives and think about, what could I get if I got there, right? Like what, if I had the money, if I had the power, if I, like what would my life be like? But there's an interesting exercise to ask yourself that and say, well, if I had whatever magical powers I wanted to make things the way I decided they should be, what would I really want, right?
Yeah.
Initially, you might think, I want power, I want good food. And clearly, I think those are part of a good life.
Yeah.
A good life is a life of prosperity. A good life is a life that includes pleasure. A good life is all those things. Mm-hmm. But you also realize that those things exhaust themselves. And there is more to having a good life than just that, right? They're part of a picture of a good life. And maybe that's having that and sharing it with others, right? It's maybe having that and sharing it with others and making sure that no one is left out of that prosperity, right? And you have to examine that and think through that and say, well, what is it that, so I think like, what are the fruits? The fruits are like a life in which you begin to express that good life more. And it's probably good to see if people are recognizing around you, but also to recognize that sometimes even your entire community can be in a rut, right? That's I mean, it's funny because, philosophy mythically, right, in terms of the stories we tell about philosophy.
Yeah.
Our first philosopher is Socrates. And Socrates is someone who's killed by his community for teaching philosophy, right? He has to drink hemlock. The famous dialogues that we often study of Socrates written by Plato. Like we don't have his writings, we have Plato's writings. And some other people's writings of who Socrates was, but are these dialogues that are around this trial, right, where he's and even when we read the other dialogues, Socrates is often positioning himself as someone who is pointing out to the people of Athens all the ways they're not getting things right. Yeah. So he seems very against his community at times, but he's also not, right? There's an interesting point in which he is he's sorting throughout with a student one of the dialogues. I mean, this is a dialogue. It's written by Plato, so it's Socrates the character. But he's sorting out with one of his students who comes to him, Crito, who comes to him and says, hey, this is after his trial. He's been condemned with corrupting the youth of Athens. The leading men of Athens have said, well, you're such an awful corruption. You need to die, right? You need to, and he has to drink hemlock. He has to drink poison. So it's a period between that trial and him drinking the poison. It's an interesting story because like part of what has happened is these ships have arrived from Delos and they are, there's sort of ceremonial obligations that community has that when they're there, they're not allowed to hold executions. So he's got this period of time, right? But it's about to end, right? Yeah. And Crito comes and says, hey, Crito's one of his students who's very wealthy, very connected. His dad is probably one of the people who condemned Socrates, right? But he's like, hey, I've worked it out. We can sneak you out, right? We can get you out. We can get you somewhere else. And then the dialogue this is in becomes a series of arguments from Socrates on why he shouldn't leave, why he should accept his death, right? And one of them is really this interesting argument that says, like, basically, I'm part of a community, right? I was born here. I was brought up here. And all the things I've done are from this community. I'd be rejecting that community, right? And I'd be demonstrating that it's okay to reject the community. Like if I decided I shouldn't be, even if the justice is injustice, I shouldn't be subjected to justice, I undermine justice, right? I undermine the very laws of the society I'm part of.
Doesn't that in and of itself prove that he's not corrupting the youth?
I mean, maybe. I mean, yeah, I'm sure that's part of why Plato writes it that way, is to like say, yeah, right.
Oh, he kind of, okay.
And maybe it happened that way, but yeah, no, I think that's part of the argument of the text, right? It's not.
We shouldn't have killed Socrates.
Yeah, I mean, many of these are kind of arguments to because by his later students, like, you guys made a wrong decision here, right?
And here's why.
Yeah, so I forget what the question was.
It was the fruit of, we were talking about good life, good values, and what is the fruit of philosophy.
Yeah, and so sometimes it doesn't seem like it's very good, right? Because
you were saying that your community around you might be in a rut,
right?
And so you might not even know how do you know what a good life is when everybody around you is not,
right? And so like part of that is like he does seem to rely on community a bit, even if he thinks they're at odds, right? And there is a level in which I think that's part of how is that it helps you be an important contributor to your community. Socrates just thought his contribution was to help people understand how little they understood, right? And in Plato's dialogue, to his defense, as a character at least, when it comes back to him, they're like, well, what do you know? He's like, I don't know anything, right? Like what I've learned through my practice of philosophy is how little I know.
Oh, yeah. Okay, fifth question. What do you think a good question would be for a philosopher? That for a young man or a younger man that wants to learn philosophy, what do you think a good fifth question would be?
Like that. So I couldn't come up with a fifth question.
Well, it's all improv.
Let me punt it to you.
What do you think a good question for yourself would be for someone like myself that wanted to fail at philosophy and couldn't come up with a fifth question, or wants to ask you about what question you would ask yourself?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yes.
That's a thinker.